You want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered? YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. See that name right there? Roland Martin Unfiltered. Like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications so when we go live, you'll know it. Folks, welcome to BeWoke.vote. I'm your host, Roland Martin, also the host of Roland Martin Unfiltered. And we think about some of the greatest organizers and teachers. When we think about the Black Freedom Movement, some call the Civil Rights Movement, we often hear the names like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We hear, of course, Roy Wilkins. We might hear about Fannie Lou Hamer. But I've always said two of the most unsung heroes, Ella Baker, one of the greatest organizers that we have ever seen, and also my next guest, Reverend James Lawson. He joins us right now. Glad to have him here.
Thank you. Good to be here. Glad to see
you. So I was having a conversation with Omar, who's working behind that wall right there. And we were talking about young folks and voting and how we keep people mobilized. And I said the most underappreciated aspect of the Black Freedom Movement was the fact that y'all taught folks, that was teaching, that was training. You didn't just wake up, go to a rally.
No, that's right.
You taught folks first.
Yes, sir. We help people to interpret our history, not so much from the perspective of the conventional wisdom, but from the point of view of equality, justice, freedom, that they were human beings. They had the greatest gift of life, and that they had to cultivate that gift in every respect: heart, soul, mind, strength, capacity to be alive, and to be human, and to act together. So we mobilized many people. Congressman John Lewis is a consequence of that work that I began in 1958-59 in Nashville, Tennessee. We help people to prepare for the short term direct action, nonviolent direct action, as that movement emerged. But we also help prepare people for the long run of their lives and for the quality of their lives. And of course, a significant part of that was the fact that as a human being, you can stay awake, you can be alive, you can love, you can serve, you can dissolve injustice in yourself and outside yourself, and you can keep at it with your neighbors and with other people. So that movement was the greatest movement America had from 1775, I'm going to say, to 1955 and beyond. The 1955 20th century rendition of it was the greatest movement in modern times.
You call it, though, when I last talked to you, you have your own name for it. Other people call it the Civil Rights Movement. They might call it the Black Freedom Movement.
Yeah.
But you invoke Rosa Parks in it.
Yes, I call the main energy of that period the Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolent Movement of America. Or I call it the Rosa Parks, Martin King Campaign for Equality and Justice, rather than calling it the Civil Rights Movement.
Why?
Because in a society of male domination and chauvinism, in a society where there's been for 400 years so much sexism and racism, so much economic cruelty and oppression, the American people do not have choices. The conventional perspective of history excludes too much of the history of cruelty. James Baldwin spoke about the bloody catalog of our history. That bloody catalog is more influential today in many, many people than any other facet of American history. And it's blind, it is invisible, it's unseen, and therefore many people yield to it. The 53 million white women who voted for Trump in the last presidential election were yielding to those dark forces that are invisible, but are visible if we want to make them visible. And so our movement sought to make those forces visible so that we could see them, and then we could dissolve them. We could fight back, we could resist, we could create an alternative vision of what we can become.
I've had people tell me, dude, why do you keep focusing on the teaching and the training? I interviewed Dorothy Cotton leading up to MLK 50. And it was her last sit-down interview before she passed away. And her job, she had the most important job in SCLC.
That's right.
And in her book, she writes about it. She said the people who wanted to come into the SCLC, they had to come into my classes. We had to assess where they were mentally. She said, take out all of that other stuff that was in their head.
That's right.
She said, reprogram their brains and then send them out. And when I see what Reverend Dr. William Barber is doing, every time he and I talk, he said, we're not having rallies, we're having trainings. We're having workshops. He said, we're teaching people because people don't quite understand what is required to actually create lasting change.
In the first instance, they do not, I'll say it another way, in many cases, people growing up in the United States, birthed and raised here, do not understand that in the first instance, the gift of life is the greatest gift that we have. It is given to us. That's what the Declaration of Independence says. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that all are endowed with the unalienable rights of life, liberty, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that's never taught. That's not in the conventional conversations that people engaged in around the country. In an election year like this year of 2018, that's not either in the surface or in the headlines. It's nowhere in the conversation, in the discussion of Supreme Court and the Supreme Court justice who was recently elected to it. So people don't know that that's the heart and foundation of how this country came to be. In that sense, we were very, very unique as a people. Even though from the beginning, 1776, blacks were excluded, Indians were excluded, people who had no property were excluded, women were excluded. Because that whole idea was not an idea that this is our reality. That idea was we're going to create a country in which that ideal is the paramount feature of how we organize ourselves, economically and politically. That's a very, very different kind of scheme.
You were a university professor dealing with young people in the Nashville movement.
No, I was a pastor.
I'm sorry.
At first, I was a full-time organizer in the emerging nonviolent movement, teaching people the philosophy and the theory and the tactic of nonviolence. So, for an example, the Little Rock Nine, 1957, 58, 59. They were told by the lawyers and the NAACP and the white school board in Little Rock that if you get hit, you cannot hit back. If you get lots of terrible cussing at yourself and so forth, you may not cuss back. And that was a dominant pattern in those desegregation processes. So I tried to help them understand that what they were really being told was not to not fight back, but to fight back with dignity, to fight back with courage, to fight back with compassion. Do not allow the hostility to make you sick as a human being, but allow the hostility to be used that you conquer it and can live through it and work through it and become yourself a stronger person than you ever imagined possible.
And you had to confront that when it came to the war. And you could have gotten out of serving. And you said, I'm not going.
Well, it was actually, it's actually something else. I met my first racist epithet at age 4 in the streets of Massillon, Ohio. And I struck out and began to fight that white boy who lived in my neighborhood. We were playmates, but he was being taught that poison. That whole experience made me aware of the fact that I was called to be a human being and that names and all could not destroy me, but that they had to be resisted in order to be changed. So as I grew older, I realized, therefore, that every racist law, every racist ideology, every Jim Crow law, every no to being a man, a person in the world, I had to reject and resist. Then I recognized that the Selective Service Act was also an unjust law, and that therefore I did not want to obey it. Though I had registered in the draft, I was making the effort to follow Jesus. I was making the effort to be a person who resisted every form of injustice and cruelty to other human beings or to myself. So I decided that the Selective Service Act was an unfair act. Now, this later was confirmed in 1960 when in Memphis, as a pastor of a large congregation, I had 4 to 6 young black men who were college students who were not exempted by the white draft boards, but drafted. A student could be exempted. Paige Parker and others in my congregation were not exempted. So the death rate in Vietnam, in Memphis city, was 50% white boys, 50% black boys. Though white was the majority community. The same thing went on all across the country. Few people were aware of that. But that's how unfair and unjust Selective Service Acts were. So I simply said I would not cooperate with that. 67 then,
But you
Muhammad Ali.
You could have got a waiver.
Huh?
But you could have got
I
out of
could
that.
have gotten out of it, of course. But that's not the way of the conscience. The way of conscience is to walk through the issues that are unfair and unjust and to deal with them to the best of your ability.
And you paid for it.
Yeah, I went to prison for 13 months, federal prison. That's correct. At age 21, 22.
Did you
Interfered
have
with my college degree.
Did you have relatives or professors or friends saying,
Oh, yeah.
James, what are you doing?
No, I had.
Man, you can get out. What are you doing?
Well, not my close friends, not my younger brothers, not my father or mother. My family supported me thoroughly and firmly, and a number of friends in college also were in my camp and understood that it was in a way, this is what we're asking people to do in this election. You have to develop a conscience in which you know that voting and participating in resisting the wrong in your society is a part of the price you pay for the gift of life that you have received from the universe. That's part of the gift. And so you have to deal with that. And in the United States, we've made things so easy because we pretend we've been exceptional. We haven't had a hard struggle that the Indians didn't get decimated from maybe 11 million to less than 2 million in 200 years, or that we did not have endless wars with the Indian peoples across this nation. We've pretended all of that's hidden. But the reality is that that was invisible to some. And white political philosophers, and I also think white media people, white professors, leave that history out of the public mix so that many ordinary citizens do not know the price that has been paid by other people for them having the opportunities and access that we do have today. That's part of the reality of conventional thinking.
Earlier this year, we were in Memphis for MLK 50.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And it is still amazing and just stunning and powerful when you see that just basic sign, I am a man.
Exactly.
Where did that come from? Where? Because most people see it, but that had to come from somewhere.
Yes, that's right. It comes from black song in the centuries of slavery, especially that huge body of literature, which is called the Negro spiritual or black song. When you go through some of that music, and I remember, for an example, as a child singing "Go Down Moses, Let My People Go." Well, that's a liberation song. That's a resistance song. It comes out of the Hebrew Bible. That song and many other songs like that in that black song literature said over and over again, and oftentimes in masked language. You are not a slave, you are somebody. You are a child of the universe, you are a child of God. You are loved, you were created in love. Your task is not to allow this slavery to capture your soul or diminish your humanity, but to grow into the full bloom of that humanity. So I am a man, you are somebody, we are the people of God is a part of the kind of mantras from the past. And I use that very frequently in all of our struggles across the southeastern part of the country, in Nashville, in Jackson, Mississippi, in the sanitation strike in Danville, Virginia, all around. That was a common message from Dr. King, from Ralph Abernathy, from Matthew McCullough, from Kelly Miller Smith, from a whole range of preachers who were actively engaged in that big movement to desegregate public life in the United States.
You mentioned sanitation workers. When I interviewed labor organizers who were working with those sanitation workers, we were having this conversation, and I said, folks, I said, you know, whenever we talk about Memphis, Dr. King being in Memphis, for me, the problem is that we forget why he was there. It was those men who said, we demand respect.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I talked to some of those men, I talked to their children, and the two workers who died.
Yes.
I talked to one of the sons, and I asked him, I said, what do you want people to know about your father? Because frankly, most people don't even know those two names.
That's
and
right.
he said, I want them to know that my dad just wanted to feed his family.
Yes, that's right. They were hardworking people who thought that their responsibility with their family and for their family, with their wives and all, demanded that they stand up and seek change in that year of 1968. That's correct. Any number of them were baptized people of the churches where they heard some of these messages there. They had a deep nobility about themselves that made it possible for them to take on the economic system in the Memphis Mid-South area. And they decided that
mm-hmm.
before anyone else in the community did, you see.
Mm-hmm.
While I knew of the struggle going on and knew T.O. Jones, the chief organizer, and told him I'd be supportive in any way I could, nevertheless, they themselves made the decision that the strike was the only way they could create the power to change what they called the plantation.
And that distinction is important because, again, what often happens when history is rewritten, mm-hmm. it becomes, oh, no, this was a leader and that was a leader. And so, for instance, I mean, they tasked you with making the call to Dr. King to come to Memphis.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But it was the men who said, we are doing this.
Yeah, that's right. And I've been asked about, well, how does it feel that you invited Martin King? Well, Martin King and I were associates from 1955 on. And I went where he asked me to come all the time. That was a part of our work. He was a member of the movement. He was the symbol, in my judgment, of that movement. Mm-hmm. And he personified it because of the Montgomery bus boycott. So the phone calls I made, but the phone calls were made as a part of the strategies of the sanitation strike, as the mass meetings were a part of that strategy, as the daily picket marches that we did in downtown, as was the economic boycott, as the recruitment of young people to participate in afternoon marches. So all of that represents a part of the massive number of pieces of a movement. And then, of course, most of all, the people, the 1,300 workers, and the tens of thousands of us who supported them. So the issue for me is not conventional leadership, because it takes all of that for a movement that become a campaign that can forge the philosophy and the power that can push the envelope of injustice in the direction of justice. It cannot be done without the great numbers of people.
And what you just described is, again, in Barbara Ransby's book on Ella Baker, where she and MLK differed. She argued that MLK believed that it was pulpit to pew. Baker said, no, it's pew to pulpit. She said, when you move the people and organize the people, she said, leadership will naturally follow. I thought that was an interesting, how that was framed in that particular book.
But I want to say, white academy never understood the movement. And the tendency in the academy has been, and I teach still at UCLA, the academy's notion has always been to lift the differences, but the reality is that any kind of movement has the most vigorous kind of conversation and debate, oftentimes with even a lot of anger and fear in the midst of it. We were doing something we had never done before and had never done before in this country. We were publicly, through direct action, challenging the hostility and the segregation signs, laws, and customs and attitudes. That had never been done before. So we were doing work that we did not know how to do, except we had a passion for the sense that this was cruelty and crude, and as Martin King, of course, also reminded us, it was contrary to the Declaration of Independence, it was contrary to the Constitution of the United States, so it had to be resisted. So some of the differences between maybe younger and older, irrelevant. Martin King was only 10 years older than Diane Nash, only 11 years older than John Lewis. Martin King and I was the same age, 5 years apart. So we were all young people in that movement, in my judgment. So SNCC and SCLC did not have that much difference. I was a founder of SNCC and a participant in the organization of SCLC and the development of SCLC. So those differences are how you hammer out a consensus so that when the call is out that we strike, we strike. When the call is out that we have a mass meeting, we have a mass meeting. A movement takes a great deal of consensus, and you cannot reach consensus without oftentimes a long, hard process of conversation, debate, argument, bouncing human experience against human experience until we come out at the right place.
I was at Mason Temple on April 3rd, where they had
April 3rd, 2018.
Yeah, I was at 2018.
Yes, right.
You were there April 3rd, 1968.
That's right. I was there, yeah.
And for the folks who just don't know, I mean, I'm doing this purposely because and the reason I'm doing this is because you were there. And I need people to understand that how they've heard these things and what's been framed it's been retold by people who weren't there. That night, I think when we last talked, you said that either did you drive Dr. King to the church or made the call to say, Doc, you need to get over here because they're not trying to hear Ralph Abernathy.
Well,
they want to hear you.
We had been visiting in the motel room from around 5 o'clock on. I had agreed that I would take Martin King and Ralph Abernathy to the mass meeting at 7 o'clock. So I got there early enough so we could visit about everything that needed to be talked about. April the 3rd, by that time, it was a very stormy night. And my colleague, Martin King, was of the mind that no one would show up. And he's always fairly tired. His energy and passion for the work is what very often gave him the drive that he had. So he begged off going, and the three of us finally agreed that Ralph Abernathy and I would drive on to the Mason Temple, and that if we felt that King needed to come, we would call back, which is what happened. There were several thousand people there. Well, one of the interesting things about Memphis is that it was the first major campaign we had anywhere in the South where we had an auditorium that we could use that could seat 8,000 people. Sometimes, as in Birmingham and Nashville, we would have 4 or 5 meetings in 4 or 5 different churches, and some of us would make each church and maybe finish up at 1 o'clock in the morning. King did this all the time in our meetings. So here, the Church of God in Christ had this sizable temple that seated 8,000 people, and people standing would fill it to somewhere between 10,000, 12,000 people. So he expected it to be empty with all that rain, whereas we were in the midst of really a very remarkable struggle that had massive support from black people and a few people, white people of goodwill. And so we were there in large numbers. When Ralph and I got there, the church was already filling up, the temple was already filling up. And so as soon as we called King, he came on over there, because he was one of the reasons people were there, to hear him and to be with him.
It drives me crazy when I only hear people play the last 2.5 minutes of that sermon.
Of that speech.
And I tell people, I say, yo, that's a 43-minute and 16-second
exactly
amazing sermon, speech, lesson, lecture.
Yeah, absolutely, sure.
When you were sitting there, did you understand how major this was, just listening to it? Because obviously, we've gone our own history, but sitting there, were you going, this is an amazing speech, sermon?
Yeah. Yes, it was one of his best, and I heard that, but I was also chair of the strategy and of the work.
You were working.
Yes, and so I kept getting phone calls and people coming up to the dais and saying, somebody insists that you have to come back here and talk. And so I finally left the dais and sat down at the bottom of the aisle of where the public phone was, so that I wouldn't have to keep running back and forth. The other thing that was operative was a storm, and this building had a tin roof, and so the rain was battering that roof, and the wind was blowing, and the rafters were bouncing against the tin. So you hear all of this, but in the midst of that, this sizable crowd of people are in harmony with one another. We know that we have a task to do and that we're in the middle of it. And in the midst of that, King is speaking. So it's an astonishing evening. I've never forgotten it. I sat on those steps in some degree of awe and amazement as I saw this space and this crowd of people. So the setting itself was rather extraordinary.
April 4th.
Yep, April 3rd.
No, I got April 3rd.
April 3rd, yeah.
But April 4th.
Yeah. None of us, of course, knew that the next day would be the assassination. Martin King always talked about the fact that he would be shot down in the streets of the nation in the midst of this campaign. He started talking to us about that actually with the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November of '63.
Were it not for a promise you made to your wife, you probably would have been on that balcony.
Well, who knows? Yeah.
But y'all were meeting. Y'all have all those different.
Well, as a family, we try to eat dinner together each night. So.
And you told me, you said, I'll be home by 6.
That's right. We agreed 6 o'clock dinner, and so I was on my way home. I was in the kitchen with Dorothy when we heard the news over a television set that Dr. King had been shot.
At 6:01.
No, I just left him, not too long before that.
I was stunned when you said we immediately went back to work, that you did not really grieve until July. You said it was the work.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Well, in the midst, like these terrible times in which we live, doing creative work on behalf of truth and justice, on behalf of people, on behalf of the wonder of life, on behalf of dissolving sexism and racism, doing work is one of the best ways for us to grieve. So I recognize that as a pastor, as a religious person. So yes, 9 o'clock Friday morning we marched And I worked through the night to be sure that we were going to be there.
We're trying to get folks not just to vote.
Right, that's right.
But to get them to understand that voting is a process. But what you must do after the election is over is this. So voting is the end of one process, then after the election is the beginning of another process.
Voting is but one tactic that comes ever so often. In between, we have to be people deeply engaged in being informed about what our situation is, what the situation of our neighbors is, be concerned for racism, for economic injustice, for working families. So if we stay informed in a daily way, in our own neighborhood, in our own family, and around the community, then the voting becomes a major step that we're more than eager to go ahead and do it well. Get informed, as we in California have to be this year, because we have so many measures on the ballot, as well as Congress, and many of those measures are deceptive, some of the measures are not. So to be engaged, to be an engaged human being, not a distracted human being, but a human being who is what the Buddhists called mindful, to have mindfulness of where you are and what's going on around you. This is one of our major problems. We have a Congress that almost is unaware of the plight of 325 million people in this country. They do not know us. When the Me Too movement explodes, those 11 senators in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate and Congress, they hadn't the slightest idea what this was about. If they knew their country, they would know that second-class citizenship for women and using women as objects for sex has been a long time form of oppression in this country and elsewhere. They would have known of the rape of Indian women, of the rape of slave women. They would know that this was a part of the instrumentality of cruelty that our own country practiced in various ways. So they would know that they would have known behind the scenes, the Dr. Ford's story is but one story of millions and millions of people all across our country.
When you saw the folks, the women who were on Capitol Hill, and when you saw the folks who were banging on the door of the Supreme Court, and then Mitch McConnell says, "Oh, these angry mobs and these paid protesters, and they wanted to harm us, and this is uncivil." How would you respond to Mitch McConnell?
Well, Mitch McConnell is one of the most crude, cruel men we have ever had a political figure in this nation and as a majority leader. That's number one. And number two is that what the media calls the protests was all right, I suppose. But from my perspective, as a strategist of direct action, it was a mistake.
How?
Number one, Judge Kavanaugh, anyone who knows anything about the last 50 years in the United States knows what Judge Kavanaugh represents. Mm-hmm. He represents sexism. He does. He represents racism. The Federalist Society is a society that grew up out of the desegregation movement of the 60s and 70s and out of the Supreme Court saying that the Constitution includes everybody. The first time that ever happened from the Supreme Court was in 1954. Mm-hmm. So Kavanaugh represents that element of white lawyers, some of them evangelical, but much more than people of power, who want to wield domination and control. He represents that whole strain of people who decided that the Supreme Court is too activist. It has to go back and interpret the Constitution as in 1896 or as in 1849. It has to continue to be a Supreme Court that sees the Constitution but doesn't see all the people in the country. That's what he represents, and that's what other people on that Supreme Court today represent. That's a part of the movement of the so-called conservatism, which is not conservatism in the classical sense at all, but is the group that wants to preserve American society as a male-dominated, largely white male chauvinistic society with economic injustice extending to millions and millions of people.
When you said as a strategist, you thought they made a mistake.
Yes, because, number one, it should have been an inclusive movement. The picture should not have been primarily of women. Black people should have been mobilized in that effort. They should not have worked by themselves. They should have worked with black community groups. They should have worked with Hispanic community groups. They should have worked with male groups. They should have worked with GLBT groups. So there was a diverse, multi-ethnic, heavily mixed gender protest campaign. And because that is the way that campaigns in the 21st century must be. They must represent all the voices in this country who are seeking equality and liberty for all.
You are not afraid to challenge folks who lead organizations or movements or whatever. When I asked you about Black Lives Matter, you said, again, as a strategist, you have some serious concerns.
Yes, because all through the 20th century, all kinds of people around the world took on major tasks of doing justice in which they used the philosophy and theory and the tactics of nonviolence. Gandhi of India is the person who in 1906, as he fought against the Boer Empire and the British Empire in South Africa, tried to begin to pull this together and began to use the term nonviolence, soul force, began to use the term love force. He's the one who defined nonviolence as the use of the power of love and compassion in practical ways so that it demonstrates power to move power away from its crude elements and to move power towards community, to move power towards the use of feeding the hungry, of dissolving racism and segregation and the like. So Gandhi can be called the father of nonviolence. He in his autobiography, Gandhi insists that he's worked on this for some 50 years. He collected strikes. He participated in strikes. He participated in sit-in campaigns. He participated in campaigns to help sharecroppers in India. He fought the racism of the British Empire in South Africa and elsewhere. So activists who do not know that literature, are not paying attention to it, therefore do not have the arsenal of behavior that can move power. Sit-in campaign, Nashville, Tennessee, 1959-60. It was a group of community people who decided, and it was unheard of in the United States, we are going to desegregate downtown Nashville. That had not even been talked about. It came about because we had for 6 months weekly Saturday morning meetings where 30 to 60 of us met at Saturday morning, and we thrashed out what is the situation we're facing? What are these issues we look at? first 3 months, we did nothing but a laundry list of the plight of the Negro in Nashville, Tennessee.
So you didn't plan a march? You didn't plan a rally?
We didn't plan anything. Then the next 3 months, April, May, June, we thrashed out the laundry list and said, where do we begin to demonstrate that Montgomery bus boycott was not an accident, it's an agency of history, and it can be repeated. And the unanimous decision out of those meetings was, we will desegregate downtown Nashville. You can search the periodicals and the publications and the congressional reports, NAACP studies. You will not find that any group of people anywhere in the country at that moment had said, we're going to pull those white colored signs down. There will be no more signs. No dirty Jew. No dirty wop. No wetback. No chink. No Jap. No colored. No Negro. White only. Those signs are going to come down. That was a part of the task. This is a period of history that did not begin to end until 1960s. Understand that. That group in Nashville, I'm astonished that we came to that consensus. I'm saying to myself, good heavens, how are we going to do this? I was supposed to be the strategist. I had never organized a campaign before like that. Though I had studied studied Gandhi and nonviolence around the world for some 10 years, lived in India for 3 years and followed Gandhi. Though he was dead, I followed his people in India. I will never forget the experience when that decision was made in June, my saying to myself, what have we done? And how is this going to be accomplished? There were no guidelines at that moment. And I proceeded then, and C.T. Vivian was a pastor in the city at that time. I did not know John Lewis at that time. I did not know Diane Nash. I did not know Miriam Berry. These were all people we recruited to come to the first workshops in the fall of '59 as we began preparing ourselves to do this work. So that threw into the United States a local community that offered a methodology that had been well researched and that we knew could effectively mobilize the forces that would say those signs are immoral, they're bad, and then would have the power to force the political system, the newspaper system, the business system to say they must come down. The city has to begin desegregation. And so Nashville was the first city in the southeastern part of the country that began to pull those signs down, renovate restrooms and waiting rooms in public places, pull the public signs down, the private signs down. And of course then the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, which the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, with a lot of Republicans and Democrats supporting it, then outlawed a private or a public institution having such signs anywhere around the premises, or being able to say certain people of the USA can't come in here to have a hot dog or a Coke. So now it became law in '64. But it is Nashville that moved the people in such a fashion that we represented a power that could not be smothered and a power that could not be denied its right to demand that a little bit of justice begin.
So what do you tell somebody today? What do you tell that young person who's watching, that person who was in the 20s or 30s, who says, okay, Reverend Lawson, that's great, I hear you, but everything you're talking about, that can't be used today. That won't work today. This is a whole different world. Everything that you've done, I appreciate it, but it can't work in the 21st century.
First of all, young such a young person represents the United States of America and its conventional culture. That's what I've heard all my life, in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, and today. But they better begin to recognize that in socio-political issues, cultural issues, there are some rules that the universe will not allow to be broken. For an example, an ancient wisdom has said this. Jesus said you cannot get grapes out of a thistle bush. Jesus of Nazareth, without all the Christian dogma that gets in the way of the teacher and what the person did in his own time, you can't get grapes out of a thistle bush. You cannot get figs out of a thorn bush. You have to get grapes out of a grapevine. The same is true in terms of the principles of political struggle, social struggle. You cannot overcome the forces of Trumpism by imitating Trumpism in language or in behavior or in vision. You cannot do eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth with Trump and expect you're going to get rid of him. I think the voices that say, you know, this election is going to do it are nonsense. The forces of wickedness that Trump produced, are now on the rise in Europe as well as in the United States. Mm-hmm. So we should not be surprised if Trump is maybe only the first president of this caliber, of this kind of meanness, of this kind of power hungriness. It could happen, and I do not see national political voices who recognize the simple fact. Trump can only be defeated by a vision and a movement that does not act like Trump, but acts like people who know that they are alive and that love and truth are the ways that we best exemplify our humanity and the gift of life. There is no definition. And this is what greatly troubles me, because I listen to certain commentaries. I read the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times. I read a number of different magazines all the time, a practice that I started in 1942. And I recognize that the voices that will allow we, the people of the USA, not to lose our struggle for truth and beauty, are not there at this moment.
You just turned 90.
I just turned 90.
You spent nearly all your life in that pursuit of equality and freedom.
Yes, that's yeah. Mm-hmm.
Someone might say, if you couldn't achieve this thing in 90 years, I just don't see it happening.
Yeah.
Do you believe that it will happen for those who have been disenfranchised, who have been oppressed by white male supremacy in the United States? Can we actually achieve that?
My great-great-grandparents, we have learned, were slaves. My great-grandfather, as a very young man, with a small young son, escaped slavery going up through the Underground Railroad, through Philadelphia, up into the Guelph area of Ontario, where my dad was born. Now, all kinds of people then said that slavery is not supposed to be what's going on. We will have to destroy it. So my great-grandfather was one of the people, as a very young man, who therefore said, I'm not going to live here under slavery any longer. So we don't have slavery now. Now, I have to admit that there's some forms of slavery in other names in the United States. The people who work 60 and 80 hours a day and then have a hard time keeping food on their table or shelter over their head or caring for their children and transportation is of course, another form of slavery, though it's not called that. The point I'm making is that we're at this mark in our history because the changes to become a nation under God, where in fact justice and access for every baby is birthed, is underway. And Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, represents the old order who would like to turn the clock back. But the clock is not going to be turned back. There may be great agony along the way between now and then, but the American people already have indicated that they don't want to go back to segregation. That especially young people today, and if we could get young people to follow the example of Gandhi or Rosa Parks and to strategize their behavior. America says you must do something. Well, doing something that doesn't work is the same as doing nothing. That's Gandhi. So what we did in the Birmingham campaign, the St. Augustine campaign, the Albany, Georgia campaign, the Freedom Ride, the Mississippi Summer campaigns, where we strategized and we analyzed our system and tried to put together the strategic offense that would make a difference. That kind of work in activism is essential work for the next 100 years or so.
Two more questions. If there is a group that's assembled, and that group is Pastor Robert Jeffress, Jerry Falwell Jr., Franklin Graham, Paula White, Tony Perkins, Ralph Reed.
Yes, Ralph Reed especially.
All these white conservative evangelicals who say they all love Jesus.
No, they don't. They don't know what that means.
If that group is assembled, and you are standing before them, what do you tell them?
Well, my own idea is that it would be better for me to show them than to tell them.
Show them what?
In the 50s, Jerry Falwell, that you mentioned, Pat Robinson, Perkins, Jim Dobson, those are all people of my generation. They were all thoroughgoing, in public ways and in private ways, racist, who said segregation forever, who said Jim Crow laws are the way that we have to live. Jerry Falwell preached this on his old-fashioned revival hour broadcast on Sunday night. That was a national broadcast. Our movement out of the 50s, 55, 59, 60, made them change their story, made them stop preaching and teaching racism. We did it not by talking to them, but through the sit-in campaign, the bus campaign. Bus campaigns around the Southeast, including Lynchburg, Virginia, in which the signs came down. So that stopped them. Now, one of my friends who was a gay man from way, way back, and the theologian and evangelical, Mel White, started in that same period to tell these people that they had to stop preaching racism. They started preaching then against gay and lesbian people. Now you can see that in their broadcasts, in their sermons, in their books. So they were people who did not have the self-esteem that came up out of their very souls, out of their beings, out of their bones. They had the self-esteem that said, I'm superior than you are. I'm a man, and therefore, woman, you're submissive. So they have to have a religious teaching that gave them superiority over some other people.
Right.
So that's where the whole push against gay people and lesbian people began to pick up on the radio and in television broadcast shows. That in itself reveals how weak their religion was. Their religion was not rooted in Jesus or Moses at all, but rooted in USA culture of male chauvinism and domination of some group of people over other people. So we showed them in the movement that they had to stop. And while this hasn't yet happened in terms of gay lesbian issues, and that's a much smaller issue in terms of the numbers of people who are involved, and it's a more diverse, complicated issue because it means that we human beings have to realign our understanding of human sexuality, which many of us are not willing to do. It means, in the Christian world, it means stop saying that sexuality represents how original sin is passed from parents to babies. That's stupidity that came out of the 4th century. So a whole society has to change its understanding and see human sexuality as a good gift of creation, a good gift of life that can be appropriated for the advancement of life and for the achieving human potential. So it's more complicated in that sense. But the point I want to make is that two things. One, yes, every form of discrimination against people, whether it's for complexion or creed or politics or whatever, it doesn't matter. Every form of injustice that deprives people and babies of access must be abolished. That's the task. So it's much greater than even, our work in the United States. And the second thing then that I want to emphasize is that these enemies of human life, in many ways, they cannot be talked to very well. They have to be shown by a struggle that allows them to recognize that they're up against a soul force that they cannot smother, that they cannot stop, and that ultimately will demand that the systems of domination will change. And a part of that is what's going on today, to the great dismay of too many people. So the King movement of 1955 is the first time in a very violent civilization, Western civilization, any sizable group of people started to work to change by insisting we can use nonviolence power to create the change. Gandhi said that nonviolent power, the power of life, is the greatest and most creative power of the universe. And that if we human beings turn away from conventional wisdom towards using the gift of life, which is ours at birth, we would be surprised what the future of the human race will look like.
Last task. You come upon a young person. You come upon somebody who's in their 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s. And they say, Reverend Lawson, I listened to all that stuff you laid out. And I appreciate all of that. I just do not believe that voting will make any difference whatsoever. They ignored that sign that's at the Civil Rights Museum, formerly the Lorraine Motel, where that black girl said, all I want for my 18th birthday is a voter registration card. They say that stuff doesn't matter. You've got 30 seconds That's all you have. You might be getting on the plane, getting in the car. You might be trying to get into your house. And all you got is 30 seconds to tell them why they must vote. What do you say?
All right, I'm not sure I can handle that issue, but
A little hard for a preacher to have 30 seconds, huh?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. You cannot fulfill your life if you're not willing to engage in the tactics and strategies that makes your own life grow and helps you to build the community in which you want to live. Voting is a singular method for a people locally and regionally to govern themselves.
28 seconds.
Okay.
Reverend Lawson, I appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks a bunch. You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Hey fam, want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered, the blackest show on all of digital, cable, and broadcast. Check out our audio podcast. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Press play. You want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered? YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. See that name right there? Roland Martin Unfiltered. Like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications so when we go live, you'll know it. Hey fam, want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered, the blackest show on all of digital, cable, and broadcast. Check out our audio podcast. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. Press play. You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get